Well, it almost sounds like he fell ass backwards into a relational moment. It sounds like he was being defensive, but sounds like the first moment of authenticity you might have had.
Ass backwards in an authentic moment, yeah. I think that's a very good description. I'll have to take that one back into therapy. I think it was a kind of breakthrough. Maybe that was the whole point of the therapy. It felt like he was falling ass backwards, but maybe that's what he intended all along.
So why have you come to the session?
It was a birthday present for my father.
Is that a joke?
No.
It would be good not to make jokes in here, just in case anything gets lost in humorous translation.
Oh, I don't know if I can do that.
Is that a joke?
No.
Oh, just try not to make it very obvious. So why do you think your father suggested you come for counselling?
I think because my mother died and he can't talk about it. And my sister and I didn't speak for a year because she thinks I tried to sleep with her husband, and because I spent most of my adult life using sex to deflect from the screaming void inside my empty heart. I'm good at this. Although I don't really do that anymore.
You close with your family?
We get on with it.
Any friends?
No, I don't really have time for... Well, I have a guinea pig, but she blows hot and cold. Not a joke.
Tell me about the sex.
All of it?
You said you don't do that now.
Oh, no, I just play tennis now. Tough crowd.
I'm John Totten, and this is Between Us. Hi, how are you?
I'm okay, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's nice to meet you. I've recently become aware of your work, which seems crazy considering how prolific you are.
You're in the States?
I'm in Seattle.
And what's your background? You're a psychotherapist.
I am. I'm a psychotherapist. I teach a little bit. I do some supervision and then the podcast and kind of a hodgepodge like your career seems to be.
So what did you want to talk about? Have we started, by the way, or?
I've started recording, yeah.
The audience for?
The audience is primarily psychotherapists, but I've had a lot of response from people who aren't in the field at all.
What work did you want to talk about? Did you want to talk about it generally, or was there specific areas you're into? So, John, you might have told me these things. My mind is mushed.
No. That's okay. Here's another bit of context. I haven't produced a show in a year and a half because I've been raising toddlers. I might seem a little aimless in the interview. I've been enjoying a bit of freedom this season. Yes, the freedom to take forever on this podcast, but also the freedom not to chase a certain theme. It's allowed me to just follow whichever curiosity pops into my mind. I realized that as I prepare today's episode, that for a long time we've mainly spoken to guests who have been psychoanalytically influenced. The reason for that is that yes, it is my largest influence as a therapist, and the other reason is that I find psychoanalysis as a framework for seeing the world interesting. It can be used in philosophy and literary analysis, and as we've been researching, I think it can be used in sociology and political science. However, it's not the only psychological framework for looking at the world. And so when I hear about interesting people who bring in different influences, especially when it pertains to looking at the world and not just the treatment room, I want to talk to those people. Our guest today is one such person. Mick Cooper is a psychologist and professor of counseling psychology at the University of Roehampton, UK. He has written and lectured extensively on the use of humanistic, existential, and pluralistic therapies. I was first introduced to Mick's work by a supervisee of mine, who you will hear me in discussion with at one point. But first, Mick was nice enough to speak with me from his office in the UK. My first question for you is, you seem so prolific and so productive. Do you sleep?
I'm efficient. Well, I am very interested in the concept of efficiency. There's something called Vygotsky.
He's very important to educational and human development.
So Vygotsky was a Soviet psychologist, and he, in the 30s, very short career, died very young. he tried to develop a Marxist form of psychology, a Marxist psychology. And because Marx was very interested in the means of production, Vygotsky kind of used that idea to talk about development, and particularly then focused on the tools that we use to develop, particularly language. But it's always kind of stayed with me. I learned about it as an undergraduate. And I think the idea of like the tools that we use are just so important for like things like learning to type. Like one of the things I say to my students is learn how to touch type, because it seems like a really obvious thing. But actually, if you struggle to write an email, or it takes you 3 times as long to write an email as somebody who can touch type, it's going to have a massive impact on your working ability. When I was at school in my late teens, I learned to touch type. I learned how to use IT, and I'm fairly efficient with IT and emails. And I think those things actually make a really big difference. So,
how do you think of yourself in terms of your career? Over here, the combination of counselor and researcher is a very rare combination. And it seems like you do a little bit of both.
My practice is fairly minimal over the last few years. I think just research and teaching. And so I see myself as a researcher, a teacher, a writer. I'm very interested in the interface between social justice and social change and kind of therapeutic theory and research these days. And I've always been interested in the kind of broader spectrum rather than purely clinical practice. So I kind of see myself, in quite a kind of broad spectrum. I thought you were going to ask me, how do I see myself? How do I think about, reflect on my career?
How do you reflect on your career?
Well, I think like most people, there's a lot that I haven't done that I would have liked to have done. I kind of feel a bit, I wouldn't say failed, but I would say that I look at it and think, wow, God, all those things that I've achieved. I kind of look back at it and think, God, I wish I'd done more.
Well, the therapist brain, I want to pick at that a little bit. What kind of things do you feel regret over?
I mean, the thing I'm really interested in these days, John, is social change and social justice, and how we can use therapy to inform social justice. And the book that I've just done, which I am really pleased that I finally managed to do, is called Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, Developing a Progressive Vision for Society. It's just coming out in January. It's kind of towards taking ideas from therapy and saying, how can that contribute towards social justice? In the therapy field, I think there's enormous amount we need to learn from the field of social justice. But, I wanted to look at the other side of it. It's something I've wanted to do for the last 20 years, 30 years. I wish I'd found a way towards it sooner. I feel like I've kind of meandered and, I've been involved in other things. And maybe that was necessary to get to this work, but I'm really pleased that I've got to it now. Yeah. And been able to say, look, I think what we do as therapists towards wider well-being is massively important. I think there's so many people, of course, who don't come into therapy, and they're important too, really. And, there's so much going on in the days. I was listening on the radio today about the kind of struggles between China and Taiwan. And, of course, there's Ukraine, and there's poverty, and there's, lots of people in global south are really struggling. And I'd like to think that the work that we do as therapists, or the thinking that we've done as therapists, can make some contribution there as well.
It makes so much sense as an existentialist, as we look at the human condition and kind of what's happening around us, to think about society and social issues as they come into the counseling room.
Sure.
There are a lot of people who say they don't belong there. Does that exist in your culture?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, but I think people recognize that our clients are embedded in their world, that we know that political systems have a massive impact on people's well-being. I mean, the evidence that racism, poverty, political oppression, the evidence that those impacts on well-being is a lot stronger than some of the things that maybe in the psychotherapeutic field that we kind of assume are the kind of key factors, like, conditions of worth in the person-centered field. There's probably some evidence for that, but there's a lot more evidence that if you're struggling on the breadline, you're going to be miserable. I think most people over here would recognise that those social justice, social change issues are important for people's well-being. I guess some might say that, all right, that's outside of the scope of what we can do as therapists, and certainly there's some truth in that we can't do everything. But I think recognizing those as sources of distress, if we're genuinely interested in the well-being of our clients and the people we work with, then I can't see how we can't have a political awareness as well. I mean, from an existential standpoint, Heidegger talking about being is always in the world. Well, not that Heidegger had the greatest politics in the world, of course. It can go different ways, but certainly that kind of involvement and that interest in the world, I think, is very much part of an existential worldview. And people like Sartre and Camus were very, very politically involved and engaged, as Buber was.
Regardless of whether or not Mick got around to his work soon enough in his life, the work presented in his new book, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, is no small feat. It's a sweeping overview of what it would mean to actually change the world in favor of progress. From making the argument that socialist humanism can benefit from psychology, all the way down to specific interventions and theories that would help concretely, Mick makes the case that the integration of social justice and psychology can present society with a new kind of vision. As self-effacing as Mick seems to be about his own career, his work presents an inspiring and optimistic view of the role psychology can play in change. He references Martin Buber quite a bit in our conversation, and I see the same kind of faith and dialogue that Buber had in his writings in Mick's book, even down to the role that parenting can play in a utopian vision. His identity as a pluralist comes through, and he draws on several traditions, but as Mick will later describe to me his wariness about psychoanalysis and its cleverness, which I think is a valid critique. In reading Mick's work, I cannot stop thinking about the first book that ever caught me on fire for psychoanalysis. And that was Erich Fromm's integration of the work of Marx and Freud beyond the chains of illusion. Mick describes Fromm's read on what troubles the person in a fascist society, that they sacrifice growth and creativity for the illusion of safety and conformism, in a failure to mentalize or see beyond one specific need. He quotes Fromm as saying that we mistake thrill and excitement for joy and happiness, and material comfort for aliveness. Satisfied greed becomes the meaning of life, the striving for it, a new religion. I read your article from 2009 about a person-centered approach and some of the key differences between a person-centered approach and other approaches, welcoming the other. You seem to be passionate and kind of protective and defensive of this more humanistic style.
I am, but I am also a big lover of, I love evidence, maybe not evidence-based therapies, but I certainly love the use of evidence and research. I'd love to see counselors, psychotherapists using evidence more, actually. We can talk about what kinds of evidence. What I love about research evidence is that it can be really challenging. I wrote a paper talking about kind of evidence from an existential standpoint. And what I was saying is that what evidence can really do is challenge us, because, it's not like we come into the work without preconceptions. We always have preconceptions. Research is a great way of kind of having ourselves opened up to what is maybe more true for clients. And it's certainly not the only way. And it's certainly not unproblematic. And, we need research like we need theory, like we need, user forums. But I think research does allow us to kind of reflect on what our assumptions might be. I've been very involved in person-centered therapies and promoting person-centered therapies. But when we've researched and when we've talked to clients about their experiences of person-centered therapies, one of the things, for instance, they say is often they find the silences really difficult and not helpful. And we've seen that some clients drop out of therapy because of the awkwardness of the silences. Now, I was always trained and always thought that silences were a good thing in therapy and that it was important to provide space. And, I did it because I thought it was empowering. But from the evidence, we learned that for some clients, actually, it's not very helpful. And I think that kind of research evidence that can help us listen more closely to clients is really useful. It means we can become more client-centered rather than therapist-centered. And of course, we're naturally going to be self-centered, therapist-centered in how we think about it. We did a piece of research recently looking at the differences between the preferences that therapists have when they're clients against the preferences that lay people have when they're clients. And what we found is that there were really marked differences on certain dimensions, particularly around direction, how directed they want it to be. So therapists tended to want more space, whereas clients wanted more guidance and direction and structure in therapy. I think that was really interesting. And again, as a therapist, my tendency might be to assume that if something works for me, then it also works for my clients. But actually what we saw is that clients sometimes want something different. And, we got different background. So research can kind of open us up in a kind of Levinasian way. Emmanuel Levinas opened us to the otherness.
It's almost like you're saying research can remind us that this is an intersubjective process. It is not an objective process.
Yeah, we have assumptions, we have beliefs, we have dogmas and doctrines. I've been very involved in the development of an approach called pluralistic therapy, which is about really trying, and that's become quite popular in the UK, which is about really trying to get away from singular truths in the therapy world about this is the change process or this is what clients need. Even things like, the Alom says it's the relationship that heals. That's something I said for years, but actually it's a pretty monolithic statement. And it's kind of assuming that all clients are the same or that there's one thing that is the answer to everything. And I think in pluralistic therapy, we have our positions. We always have our positions. And it's quite emotionally challenging to have that confronted. But that's our challenge as therapists, really, is to be able to stand outside from ourselves and see things from a different perspective, not just in terms of clients' experiences or processes, but also in terms of the meta process of therapy, in terms of how therapy actually works.
It's interesting to take that statement, it's the relationship that heals, and call it a monolithic statement, where to tell a personal story that it reminds me of is I went through a period where, like I mentioned, I had 2 toddlers, and I went through a period of my own therapy where I was a patient, where I would show up to therapy and I would say, I cannot talk for 50 minutes today. And to my therapist's credit, he said, why don't we take a break?
Different clients need different things at different points in time. It's kind of mantra, if you like, which of course is a monolithic statement in itself. But
I do have to add something to this comment and say that, of course, that was still part of the relationship when my therapist suggested that we take a break. Obviously, a relationship does not require continual dialogue. But he did something very counterintuitive for therapists and essentially said, maybe this process itself is doing more unraveling than healing right now. And paradoxically helped me heal by not attempting to help me heal. We took a month off, and then when we came back to the work, I was ready to talk plenty. So tell me more about pluralism, because when I think of that word, where I go to is it sounds almost like a theological word.
It's been used in theology as well. And in theology, it's about, as I understand it, openness to different religions. It's not about not having a religion. It's not about not being Jewish or Christian or Muslim, but it's about having that position, but also having tolerance for other positions and an openness and a willingness to dialogue. So it's not a kind of relativism in the sense of nothing matters or that there's no truth, but the idea that there can be multiple truths. And I still find it, John McLeod and I started writing about that in the kind of mid-2000s. There's a really vibrant community of pluralistic therapists in the UK now, and with contacts around the world, in Australia, New Zealand. And it's both a kind of way of thinking about therapy. It's a kind of meta stance, if you like, which is about really valuing the lots of different ways that therapy can work, not getting too locked into any one position, using research and lots of different perspectives to inform the work that we do. It's also very much about collaborating with clients. So really at the heart of pluralism is the idea that, we've got a perspective on what will be helpful in therapy. Clients have a perspective, and we can talk to clients about what their ideas are. And, some clients want to contribute more than others. But, if we can develop a collaborative way of working where we choose with the clients and work with the clients to see what the best thing for them is, that's can be a very empowering and helpful process.
I'm guessing that societal trends and political trends maybe influence your focus on that. That makes me think of my experience of growing up in the States in the 80s and 90s and being taught that this society is a melting pot, and how it doesn't seem like we're taught that anymore. And I think about our own political and societal trends and yours. I'm guessing that it's challenged us to refocus on the importance of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about pluralism is one of the therapeutic approaches, one of the few therapeutic approaches that really puts that valuing of difference right at the heart of the therapy. There's been some fantastic work all over the world on working with difference, but pluralism as an approach, as a model, says let's start with an appreciation and a valuing of difference, and challenging the idea that there is one kind of monolithic truth or perspective or way. What I love about it as well is that then there's a kind of softness, because sometimes you can get a kind of radical postmodernism, which in itself can become quite dogmatic. Whereas I think pluralism needs to be critical about pluralism itself. It needs to be a kind of gentle valuing of multiplicity that also recognizes, it's not against like a purist psychoanalytic approach or a purist Rogerian or purist CBT. All those things can be really valuable. But what it does do is it kind of challenges a more dominant narrative, or a narrative that claims to be dominant, that says this is the only way to see it, and says, well, come on, maybe this, it's kind of postmodernism, really. Postmodernism without that kind of dogmatic postmodernism that isn't very postmodern. You get what I mean?
Yeah. As you're talking about pluralism, I was seeing it as theoretical pluralism, as being able to draw on different frameworks to meet different patients' needs, much in the same way I used the phrase psychodynamic. But I also realized that this could be a relational pluralism, that each person brings vastly different associations and beliefs and desires and dreads to each relationship.
Yeah.
I can't count how many of my sessions revolved around relational issues, and how many of those relational issues can be summed up as either the patient or their loved one being unable to tolerate difference in the other. And sometimes I just want to say, well, you two are different and you can't tolerate that difference. And then sometimes I ask that patient, well, would you want to be in a relationship with someone whose mind worked just like yours?
Yeah. Well, Buber says something very interesting about how you can't have dialogue if two things are the same. And a lot of the work that we do as therapists is about helping people, I think, develop an awareness and appreciation and a capacity to deal with otherness.
You've cited Levinas and Buber as very influential. And when I read Levinas, there seems to be almost an emptying of self for other, whereas Buber is tête-à-tête mutuality.
Yeah.
And maybe it's like a subtle difference in their
there
focus.
Is. Yeah, I think that's very well put, John. The thing that I think struck me most, I remember reading a book about the differences in their positions, and it was talking about their journeys through the Holocaust. But I know Levinas and his family had an absolutely awful time. Buber was less directly affected. So I think Buber's philosophy is more optimistic. It's more about dialogue with the other and a kind of sharing of perspectives, and a kind of that the focus is more on the between. Whereas, as you say, I think Levinas, the focus is more on the other, the ethical demand to be open to the other. And I think in that sense, Buber's more dialogic, is much more humanistic. There's much more a kind of faith in humanity, whereas I guess maybe because of Levinas's experiences, it's more a requirement to be open to the other. It's not just about being ourselves in a way that allows that to happen.
It reminds me that the theory often says more about the theorists than it does about reality.
I think Buber's is more religious and more spiritual as well. Yeah, but I think you're right, John. I mean, absolutely right that the theorist is so fundamental to the theory, of course. As counselors, we wouldn't expect anything else. But what I find interesting is that, I mean, I've had the kind of fortune of meeting a number of the people who've kind of developed therapies, and it makes such a difference to me, knowing the people and seeing where you kind of get to if you really believe this. That is your core belief. Like, does it take you into being a kind and caring person, or does it take you, if you're still kind of left as a kind of fairly narcissistic, self-centered, kind of slightly mean-spirited person after all that work, it does make me more skeptical. I mean, one example of the former is, I don't know if you have it so much in the States, compassion-focused therapy, which is developed by Paul Gilbert, which is a kind of combination of person-centered and CBT. It's quite structured, but it's developed very much on humanistic principles. And Paul's lovely. He's such a lovely man. And, you know, you get the compassion when you're with him. And it feels genuine. He's not perfect. But he's a lovely man to be with and to listen to. And that makes such a difference to me.
I'm calling my supervisee, Brett Baldwin. He's a young and gifted therapist on Seattle's East Side, and he's also the one who introduced me to Mick's work.
Hey, what's up? Thanks for doing the extracurricular with me.
Absolutely. It's kind of fun getting my thoughts together.
I've listened back to this talk with Mick several times. Do you remember the context of how he entered our supervision?
Oh, I do, yeah, because I was trying to get on seculartherapy.org's website, and for that to happen, I needed to prove that I had done a number of evidence-based practices. And so in my kind of intro, I was like, hey, these are all the people that inform my work: Yalom, Mick Cooper, Emmy Van Doers, and that type of thing.
Some lofty company.
Totally.
What for you puts Mick Cooper in that category?
Yeah, absolutely. So went to Seattle U, Master of Arts program. And so we were taking our existential integrative class. I think in that class we were reading Ernesto Spinelli, who's also kind of in the existential practice for psychotherapy. I think the book we were reading was like The Relational World. And I was reading it and I was like, heck yeah, this is really good stuff. So I reached out to my professor and I said, hey, Mike, where can I get more of this stuff? She was like, oh, you should check out Mick Cooper. I was like, oh, okay, cool, sounds good. And I think I had seen him on YouTube for a couple of lectures, stuff like that. And so the book that was recommended to me was The Existential Psychotherapy and Counseling: Contributions to a Pluralistic Practice. I'll kind of give you a little picture of what was going on at the time to kind of capture the moment. We are all applying for our internships, and we're all in these interviews, and we'd often be asked in these interviews, what evidence-based practice do you use? Asked in a way as if it was the technique itself we were using that what would be of help to our client. Not too many questions on our take on therapy, what brought us to the work, but very much concerned with what actions we would be doing in the room that would result in symptom reduction only. I'm coming from this program where the basis is not only in its existential perspectives, phenomenological perspectives, but a deep emphasis on the relationship. Almost to the point, and it depends who you talk to, that technique itself didn't even matter. So throw the canned responses out, throw all of that stuff out the window. Your job is to sit, listen, witness. Right. And so in this process of doing interviews and wanting to be, you know, attractive as a potential intern, I'm kind of in two camps here. And so one camp, I'm hearing evidence-based practice is the only thing that will help. There are right things that you should say and do in session. It's the only thing we have evidence for, so it's the only thing that we want to hear. And then it's in my camp, in the other camp where I'm getting trained, some of the more even extreme opinions held by some of the folks in my program is that this is broad, vague, messy work, and the relationship heals all. Technique doesn't matter. And so I'm kind of going like, well, what's going on here? Because like there's got to be something in between, right? And so I read Mick Cooper and I go, finally, someone who's based in existential thought, someone who understands the impact of the relationship, and someone who can also point to the evidence and say, hey, guess what? These things help too. This is all a part of a pluralistic practice that we can bring together, and no one modality, no one evidence-based practice has the monopoly on how therapy should be done. People can do things in a lot of different ways, and it helps a lot of different people. And so, frankly, reading Mick was like a breath of fresh air because it brought a sense of clarity to the whole work, and it didn't have to be just relationship, and it didn't just have to be evidence-based.
This is a topic I think about a lot. I see a lot of clients have what I call empathy fatigue. They're exhausted, and every time something enters the news, they can feel debilitated. It has me thinking a lot about the value of empathy, or maybe the sustainability of empathy versus the sustainability of compassion.
How would you see them as different?
Well, I don't know if I have like a textbook definition. I have my own understanding, but I think of compassion as having as being more of an understanding and a focus on what someone needs, as opposed to empathy being an emotional experience of what someone who's suffering is experiencing. I think a lot about what an emergency room doctor might experience. I would imagine that if an emergency room doctor would experience empathy for every patient, they would feel quite a deal of burnout. Whereas I'm also imagining that many emergency room doctors experience a great deal of compassion, and that it maybe sustains their work.
And I guess in our therapeutic work, a lot of it, particularly from the humanistic and I'm sure psychodynamic angle and CBT, it is, as you say, a lot of it is around empathy. And maybe that's why we come into the work. And yeah, I think people can get burnt out. A lot of my work's been around something called relational depth, which is around a kind of deep contact. But mostly people describe that as very energizing. I mean, I know for myself that actually the work that I find most exhausting is when I'm disconnected from a client and when I'm not able to connect. That is really hard. That's really, really hard work. Where there's an emotional connection, I nearly always find that energizing. And
what do you do with that? How do you think about it? The disconnection when that happens.
You know, Eugene Genlin, who was a follower of Rogers, said that for some people it's more difficult to be connected to their experience. Maybe they don't have the language or the tools, or maybe that they are disconnected to protect themselves. But we have something in the humanistic field, for instance, called the experiencing scale, where you have kind of very low levels of experiencing, where someone is very much at a narrative level and telling stories, but very disconnected from it, down to much more deeper emotional processing. And if I'm with a client where I'm feeling disconnected, my experience is generally it's because they're at that kind of more narrative level and talking about their experiences. And that's challenging work because, I mean, my sense, as the research suggests, is that therapy tends to be more helpful when people are at deeper emotional experiencing processing levels. But of course, at the same time, you don't want to be pushing clients in a particular direction. So there's that challenge of finding the balance between allowing clients to talk about where they're at versus supporting them to go more deeply into their experiencing. And certainly from a pluralistic standpoint, you don't want to be kind of assuming that deeper emotional experiencing is the right way of doing therapy. But at the same time, you don't want to totally let go of that position.
In psychoanalytic terms, what I hear you saying is you take the countertransferential information of being disconnected and use that as information about the client's own experience of themselves.
Yeah, but I think, pluralistic standpoint, you would use that, but be cautious about it. And it might be completely wrong. It might be wrong. Sure. I think there's a lot of kind of, sometimes we can get caught up in our own cleverness. And I guess I've always been a bit wary, if I'm honest, about psychoanalytic ideas. I mean, I like very much some of the more relational psychoanalytic style, people like Jeremy Safran. I think sometimes it gets too caught up in, I think the risk when we're going back to the issue we talk about in research is that I think sometimes the cleverness of it, if you like, can end up just being a kind of reinforcement and a justification of whatever you believe in the first place. And I suspect that's my own experience. I've been going back to what we were talking about before. My doctor has kind of sent me off to a psychoanalyst when I was 16, 17 at the Tavistock, which is a very well-known institute. I think very kind of classical psychoanalyst. And I just remember sitting there and thinking, what the hell is going on? It's somebody who wasn't telling me what I was doing, just seemed to be objectionable, seemed to just talk about the breaks, and I'm sure they thought they were doing something very helpful. But I think I found the rigidity of it quite problematic.
Certainly.
I don't know, but, sometimes I think maybe actually I learned a lot. There was one moment where I think the therapist was so frustrated with me. I think I'd accused the therapist that, like this was about a year in, of being kind of quite arrogant. And I think he said to me something, I said, there's no way that I can ever challenge what you think. And he kind of came back to me and said, well, you're just as bad as me, or something like that. And I'm sure it wasn't, I'm sure he was stemming out. He probably spent years working out in supervision after, or maybe that was very narcissistic. But it was actually really, I sometimes wonder, it was really helpful. I remember going away thinking, actually, I am quite closed. So I think maybe, you know, this kind of desire to be openness, maybe it was actually formed by that experience in psychoanalysis of actually being really challenged about my own dogmatism.
Well, it almost sounds like he fell ass backwards into a relational moment. It sounds like he was being defensive, but sounds like the first moment of authenticity you might have
Ass
had.
backwards to an authentic moment, yeah. I think that's a very good description. I'll have to take that one back into therapy. I think it was a kind of breakthrough. And maybe that was the whole point of the therapy. It felt like he was falling ass backwards, but maybe that's what he intended all along.
Here's me talking with Brett Baldwin again.
When I talk to him, I get the feeling that evidence basis doesn't necessarily have the connotation for him that it does for us of only meaning manualized therapy. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like one of the things that he's really excited about is the way in which evidence and research can point us towards humanistic and pluralistic approaches.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so he doesn't shy away from evidence. He likes research, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah. No, he's very much into it. And in his book, he mentions, he's like, how do you even define existential therapy? How can we even operationalize this type of thing with thinking about choice, freedom, responsibility? Like, these things can't necessarily be put into a very strict kind of manualized thing. Mm-hmm. And so that in itself makes it hard to kind of capture and know what we're actually doing when we're saying we're doing existential work.
Right.
Yeah.
As I listen back to him, I think I missed some of the profundity of that in the moment, and realized later that really what he's doing is he's taking existential and humanistic approaches and giving us kind of more language for how it actually works. Yep. And nobody's really ever done that, I don't think.
No. When it comes to the whole theme, it can be so like ripped open and so open-ended that it's hard to know, like, what are we actually doing in session that has to do with reinforcing our client's agency and responsibility. I know about Nietzsche, and I know what he would have to say about recreating our values and the importance of that. But like, existential therapy isn't me telling my client what Nietzsche said, you know?
Right.
And so like, okay, then what am I actually doing in session? What am I actually doing that is tangible, that can help the client find language for their experience and relate it back to their life? And he does a good job of finding that language, I think. I think the other thing I like about Mick is that he isn't a dogmatist, obviously, in like what he believes about what is helpful about therapy, and has the client inform what is helpful, and doesn't just look at the research and say, this is what's helpful, client, listen to what is going to work. He recognizes in the work that it's not our job to necessarily use our power or our expertise or our knowledge to like be above our client in any way, but like to listen to what the actual feedback of their experience is in session and have that inform the rest of the work.
Who are we to say for everyone what isn't healing? It seems like to really step back and get off our high horse would be to acknowledge that therapy is a kind of healing practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what is healing for everyone is not always the same.
Yep. And that use of the word healing didn't land in my interviews at all.
Yeah.
It was it's not measurable. You can't measure healing. What we can measure is symptom reduction. And so that's the only thing that we're concerned about.
You interned at the organization that I worked for out of grad school. Mm-hmm. And what I know about meeting with those clients is they needed someone to meet them face to face.
Yes.
In person to person without a manual in hand.
Yes.
Yeah. And so Mick Cooper is creating a technique without creating a manual.
Right. Yeah. Drawing the edges a little bit to what this work can be, not what it ought to be, not what it should be, but helpful ways in which we can use good language to kind of make it a little bit more tangible.
I agree with your criticisms that the rigidity and the arrogance and the cleverness is something I think that can be a trap.
I think you see that in the research about negative experiences in therapy. about when the therapist is really closed. I mean, Jeremy Safran was wonderful. It was such a tragic loss. But I mean, his work on alliance ruptures, if you're hitting a rupture with a client to stand outside of your model, and I think that applies not just to psychoanalysis, but CBT and person-centered. You can't work for a rupture by sticking to the same model. If a client says that they're frustrated with you as a person-centered therapist because you keep on going, don't just go to that. Actually engage and talk. Something else that I was reading about recently, which I really loved, was Charlie Gelso's work on different levels of relating and this idea of the real relationship and the importance of that over and above even the alliance. So you've got the kind of transferential relationship, then you've got the alliance, then you've got the real relationship. And the real relationship were just two human beings, both vulnerable, both with problems, both grown-ups, both doing our best. Clients aren't children, and I hate that, well, apart from when they are children, but, adult clients are adults. And a lot of therapies, I think, can get quite infantilizing about our patients. And that I really struggle with. And I think I struggle with that from a kind of social justice perspective. Why is it that just because you've done this training in something, somebody else might have done training in accountancy rather than psychotherapy, but why does that make you more of an adult than the other person?
I was always taught early on in my journey into this field that people went into this field to kind of figure out their own problems. But I think it's actually more often the opposite. People go into this field to kind of avoid exploration of themselves and to have some sense of authority. This gets back to Buber in my mind. When you're coming at it from a place of authority, it's not worth much, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think there can be a payoff in being a therapist that you're not the one with the problems, that you're contrasted with the one with the problems. You're the one who's sorted. But, even the people that I met, going back to what I was saying earlier, even the people I met right at the top of the field, they have a lot of problems. They have a lot of mental health problems. And what does that say about us and the work that we do and where we get people? I think it's really important. It's not like a kind of escalator where at the top of it you turn out cured. And I include myself absolutely in that as someone who still struggles with mental health issues at times. I had therapy recently with my daughter. We there's some issues that we need to talk through, and it was absolutely brilliant. It was brilliant, so helpful to have therapy. And I think therapy can be really useful on that relational front. It can do so much. I counted once, and I've had something like 20 different episodes of therapy with different therapists, and some, I think the longest was about maybe 2 years. I haven't been in therapy much for the last maybe 20 years, but I did have this episode with a couples and family therapist to work through some stuff with my daughter, and it was really helpful. It was quite an interesting exercise, just writing all the lists, listing all the different episodes of therapy that I've had.
I don't want to get too much into your family, but
I'll stop paying for you, aren't I, John?
Well, no, I'm a dad. My oldest is 3.5. I don't suspect that the conflicts will stop after toddler years. The interplay of our personal lives and our creative interests, our family interests, and coming into our work, and I think you might have said that your practice itself has dwindled a bit. I'm in a place where, personally, counseling is, in a way, less important to me than ever because of family, because of creative passions, and also I think in a way that's been beneficial to my work. I find it really interesting that you went back into counseling with your daughter. This is stuff that I feel like we should talk about more as therapists.
Yeah, I think so. I think it kind of breaks down that hierarchy between, it's like you have at the bottom the kind of lay person, then on top of that you have the trainee, and then you have the trainer, and then the therapist, and then the supervisor, and then the people who write the books. There's this kind of hierarchy, and I just don't think it works like that in terms of mental health and well-being. I think certainly from an existential standpoint, we're all thrown into this world trying to work out what the hell's going on. And you can have a lot of therapy. It's not necessarily going to give you those answers, because I think existentially, I'm not sure there are answers. There's just more questions, a bit like, the more you look at something microscopically, the more it opens out more issues and more possibilities. So I think we should talk about that more. And I think that helps build that kind of collaborative relationships where we're not being collaborative with our clients because It's a technique. We're being collaborative with our clients because we genuinely believe that they've got stuff to offer that we might not know about, and that there's a kind of humility there. I think it's just so important. But I think it's got to be a genuine humility. It can't be humility as a technique. And existentialism gives you that humility, I think, because it just poses such difficult questions. You know, when you're sitting there reading Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, there's such difficult questions. And you realize that these brilliant minds, if they couldn't answer these amazingly complex questions, then there's not much hope for the rest of us.
Of course. A question that I think about all the time. Do you ever think about what kind of person you would be without your experiences of therapy?
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
I would be a disaster.
How would you be different, John?
I use my marriage as the best example because I think my therapy provided me with a bit of an inner quiet in my 20s that I would not have had maybe until my 40s or 50s. And I would have missed my wife by then. But it gave me a bit of inner quiet to kind of choose to pursue someone who was better for me than I otherwise would have.
Yeah.
And I remember specific sessions where it was like, let's just sit with this and let's just be for a moment.
Yeah.
That was like one blossom of opportunity. And there's been others.
Yeah.
But obviously a big one.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing, John. I love that blossom of opportunity. It's a really nice way of describing what therapy does, kind of blossoms of opportunity that you can then take. Yeah. And I think that you can then follow different paths. And certainly if I think about that question that you've asked, I think I would be, well, again, interestingly, I think a lot of it is relational. I think it's helped me find a way of being in relationships that I really enjoy. For me, in my inner life, you know, like I've struggled with anxiety. I think it's helped me do stuff despite that. I couldn't honestly say that therapy has helped me be a less anxious person, but it has helped me achieve stuff and kind of pursue life and not let that kind of absolutely cripple me that I think it could have done. But I think it's also helped me kind of find different ways in systems and structures and not to follow the paths that were laid out for me. Like I was the youngest sibling, and I think that was such an obvious path there to be the one who was always kind of like childish and playful and not kind of serious or leadership. And therapy, by being with the therapist to help me see that, it provided me with that opportunity to think about different roles. Like a lot of my work at the moment is in leadership roles, and I love that. I love being able to do that. I don't think I'd ever would have done that without therapy because I just wouldn't have believed that that was me.
That's something I'm going to use with my anxious clients. The way you described it was that it hasn't made me necessarily a less anxious person, but it's helped me do a lot of things that I love in spite of that. I think that's really beautiful that I have so many patients that want the cure from therapy, and I might have to say, I don't know if this is a cure.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for me, I've never found one. There might be one out there. But I think kind of, you know, as we say in existentialism, learning to dance in the rain rather than waiting for the storm to pass.
I appreciate your time.
Thanks, John.
This has been Between Us. Our thanks to our guest, Mick Cooper. His new book is Psychology at the Heart of Social Change. And thanks to Brett Baldwin for hopping on the phone with me last minute to discuss Mick's work. Between Us is produced by myself and Mason Neely, who also composes our music. Our research assistant is Rose Bergdoll. Find Between Us where you find podcasts and subscribe. And if you like the show, leave us a review. And until next time, take care.